Hello and welcome to North 100, a Canadian Highlander podcast. I'm Liam, and joining me today, as usual, are Alex and Jeremy. We don't have Serge, I don't really know what's going on, but we're still going to do the podcast for you. A reminder that just as everything else on the Loading Ready Run video network, this podcast is brought to you by you over at patreon.com/loadingreadyrun. So thanks so much for your support. We couldn't do it without you. And before we get any farther into the episode, we need to do our opening segment, The Best Card You're Not Playing. Alex, what do you got for us this week?
I've got a friend who made a showing on the last Highlander stream we did. I'm talking about Butcher of the Horde. This is one of the best $2 rares I've ever bought. He's a big homie. So this card really sings in Aristocrats, but it's pretty solid nonetheless. So it's 1 red, white, black for a 5/4 with flying.
That already sounds pretty good.
It has an activated ability. Sacrifice another creature. Butcher of the Horde gains your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, or Haste until end of turn. A 5/4 flyer for 4 with no other text on it is pretty premium. Like this'll, the floor on this card is a 4-turn clock with evasion, which is pretty sweet. It's a sack outlet that activates for free. It's able to attack and defend, maybe crawl you back into a game. Sometimes it can attack the turn it comes down. It's just all singing, all dancing.
There's some kind of he protect, he attack joke here.
Yep, he protect, he attack, but mostly he snack on your board.
I see. Well, that was the joke.
Yep.
Yeah.
I love this card. It just, I can't think of a lot of games where I've lost after this hit the table, but there's been a few.
What choice do you make the most often?
Haste happens a lot. Lifelink, I think, would be second. I very seldom activate Vigilance.
That's probably about the same for me.
Yeah, it's like you want to crack in fast and then, maybe
Race.
buffer your life total a little bit if you're behind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think this card's playable in more decks than just Aristocrats? Or?
I think it could be. I mean, again, like the floor for this card is really, really good. It's just like if you have some sort of deck that just wants a pretty aggressive, efficiently costed beater, look no further.
Yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable to play this. And like, if you're playing any Mardu aggressive deck, you can play it because you likely have some 1-drops that are going to get outclassed, and often cashing them in for 5 life or haste on the Butcher is going to be worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Same sort of thing in 4-color Blood, where if you because you're playing a lot of the mana dorks in that deck, you're also playing some things like Lingering Souls and a bunch of Planeswalkers that produce tokens. Sometimes being able to cash those in for 5 life or Vigilance or Haste is going to be worthwhile. So
there are many words on this card.
Yeah, lots of text.
All right, so it's a sweet one. We recommend you play it. So today we're talking about something kind of interesting. We're going to be talking about some metrics for the format, or tests, if you will. And so what we mean when we say a test is, I'm going to describe it with an example. In Legacy, there used to be something called the Goblin Lackey test. Maybe there is again now that Deathrite Shaman is banned. We'll find out.
it might be back.
The Goblin Lackey test is basically this idea of if someone plays turn 1 Goblin Lackey against you, and Goblin Lackey is a red 1/1 that says if Goblin Lackey deals, or when Goblin Lackey deals damage to you, or a player, I guess, you can put a goblin from your hand into play. Whenever Goblin Lackey deals damage to a player. So, if you somehow manage to make this ping yourself, cash money, that's not actually the interaction that comes up, though. Basically, this can churn out endless advantage, and you mostly die if they ever hit you with Goblin Lackey. It puts a Siege Gang Commander into play, or something else equally horrible and expensive, and you die. So the Goblin Lackey test in Legacy was, what's your deck's plan to beat turn 1 Goblin Lackey? You had to have a way to answer it. And if you were playing a deck where the answer to can your deck beat turn 1 Goblin Lackey was no, or the answer was, well, I kill them on turn 1 and then I don't have to deal with it, and it was like this 1% thing to happen, then your deck was largely not playable. So we're going to translate that test into Highlander. And obviously in Legacy with the Goblin Lackey test, there are 4 Goblin Lackeys in a 60-card deck. this is going to happen often.
And goblins was an established archetype, which
Right, yeah. Popular archetype was something you
you can
could-
expect it.
Yeah, you were going to play against
It
it.
was one of the more played decks at the time.
So in Highlander, obviously, the format is more varied and the cards are more varied. You're just not going to have the same early turns as usual, but there are still some general tests that you can apply. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of those tests and try and give you an idea of how to evaluate whether or not your deck is playable. So if you are answering all of these tests with no, you're potentially going to find that you need to do some work on your deck to make it be able to answer these questions yes. But fear not, we're also going to talk about how to make the answer to these questions yes.
And furthermore, if you do answer no to some of them, that doesn't necessarily mean your deck is bad, because some decks naturally have a strength in one area
And it
at
also
the expense of a weakness elsewhere.
it'll also depend a bit on your meta. For example, like if you have no aggressive decks in your format, you don't need to worry so much about the aggressive tests.
Yeah. So without further ado, let's get into the first one. And that, Jared already sort of started talking about it, but it's can your deck beat a linear aggressive draw? So,
Ooh, instead of Goblin Lackey, how do you deal with turn 1 2-power creature?
yeah, exactly. Falconwrath Gorger or whatever. Does Gitu Lava Runner kill you? And so basically the nature of this test is like decks like mono red, green red, basically red X or red by itself. Decks are in Highlander gonna Goldfish turn 4, turn 5. They're always gonna kill you by then if you don't interact with them. So you need to talk. You need to know if I can beat that. So Alex, can you talk about some ways that you can go about like answering yes to this question? Maybe some decks that can beat it.
Yeah. So what does aggro hate? Aggro hates walls. Aggro hates efficient multiple for 1 removal. Aggro hates any kind of effect that prevents it from attacking. So you can do stuff like play defenses. You can play efficient removal in the form of either sweepers or like 2-for-1 spells like Arc Trail, Fork Bolt are kind of the bane of a lot of aggro decks. You can rob your opponent of their ability to attack. That's getting a little further off the sort of like main idea of what you can do, because like you're getting into slightly more specific archetypes like prison and to a small extent academy decks do that. Like I'm talking effects like ensnaring bridge, moat, crumbling sanctuary.
Crumbling Sanctuary doesn't stop you attacking; it just stops you taking
Well, it
damage.
stops you from dying. So
Yeah.
but like effects like that.
Yeah. I was gonna say, and the one other thing is they need to be fast.
You need to find and play them ASAP.
Yeah, one of the things I've found actually is that Ensnaring Bridge is almost a little too slow because you're not able to get all the cards out of your hand in time for the Ensnaring Bridge to get online.
I've found myself losing to Ensnaring Bridge mainly in the late game of the games that I've played against it. Ensnaring Bridge is a 3-drop artifact. Creatures with power greater than the number of cards in your hand can't attack. So the sort of decks that want to play this want to stick it and then dump everything in their hand and then just go to top deck mode, and then their aggro opponent can't attack them.
Well, yeah, and the theory is on your turn you draw a card and you have enough mana that you're going to be able to play whatever you draw. So on your opponent's turn, the number of cards in your hand will always be 0.
Yeah.
So they'll just never be able to attack you for any meaningful amount of damage.
Yeah. But that does take a while to like find, play, dump your hand.
Yeah. So, looking at some of the more common decks in our metagame, what are their plans against red? If you can sort of think of it.
You mean besides like silver bullet cards?
No. It's sort of applying those concepts you just talked about. So, like for instance, Jeskai plays Forked Bolt and Arc Trail. That's the way
Lightning
it beats
Helix.
it. Yeah, Lightning Helix.
Yeah,
That sort
actually,
of thing.
yeah, that's a good example because it's like that Lightning Helix you can use to remove a threat or pull yourself a little bit ahead. You know, it's sort of like undoing their Lightning Bolt.
Yeah, one thing you want to be careful of is life gain isn't actually by itself a super good way to stop aggressive decks.
Correct.
Because they're often going to have a lot of repeatable sources of damage. So if you play something like Heroes Reunion, which is green and white to gain 7 life.
However, incidental life gain is real good.
Yeah, that's where I was going.
Oh yeah, sorry. I mean, if you had some examples.
Yeah, so like Kitchen Finks is sort of the classic anti-aggro card. It's
Yep.
1 Selesnya hybrid for a 3/2 with persist, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life.
It's such a pain.
So it's gonna block two times, usually trade with 2 of their creatures and gain you 4 life. So that's the kind of thing you're looking for, as opposed to just straight up gaining 7.
Even
Yeah.
if it's in French. Ephemer sounds so much better than instant, by the way.
It does.
Quite a lot
It is.
nicer.
It is way sweeter. And the art on this card is amazing.
But yeah, there's a bunch of like creatures with lifelink are good. This is why like stuff like Batterskull and Wormcoil Engine are good. Although again, as Liam said, you have to have a plan for getting those out like before you are killed.
Yeah,
And before they stick some ability to prevent you from gaining life.
because one of the classic sort of paradigms with the red decks is you're like almost there, but your life total is at like 6 or less, and then you tap out to play your game-winning bomb, be it Batterskull or Wormcoil, and if you get 1 hit in, you win, and then they just burn you out.
Yeah.
You just never get
Just
to
go straight to the face.
never get to do anything meaningful with these cards, and just
Yeah.
it goes to show that some of these cards are just a little too slow.
Yeah, or like you crack in with Batterskull and they're like skull crack and then untap and kill you.
Yeah. Jared, can you talk to me about some decks that fail the mono red test but are maybe still playable, or fail the mono red test but we still play anyway because they're fun?
Yeah, so most of the decks I play fall under that category. I think one of the classic ones is High Tide. High Tide doesn't really have a ton of meaningful interaction. You have a few counter spells. You play a bunch of the 2-mana counter spells. You play Spell Snare, but you're not really interacting in any meaningful way with what they're doing.
Well, certainly, like they have 60 lightning bolts and you have 10 counter spells
Yeah,
or less.
yeah, their threats certainly outweigh your answers. And one of the things that differs High Tide from other combo decks is that High Tide's not actually a super fast combo. It's like pretty hard to combo on turn 3, almost impossible. Still pretty hard on turn 4, and turn 5 is a more realistic combo turn for High Tide.
Mm-hmm.
So you're just a little slower, even on your like better than average draws than most of the other combo decks, and so it's just going to be hard to stack up to mono red.
The other deck that I was thinking of that you play that is not very good against mono red is Seinfeld.
I don't know what you're talking about. I 2-0'd mono red in the finals when I won a tournament.
Yeah, by drawing Mental Misstep, Disrupting Shoal, and Ancestral Recall.
Woof.
I didn't cast recall once in the finals.
You pitched it to Disrupting Shoal to not die.
Yeah,
All right.
I understand what's important. There's a lot of people who wouldn't have pitched their recall to counter.
Can you talk about why Seinfeld would typically be bad against mono red?
So
Because you beating mono red is like
it's anomalous.
abnormal.
Yeah, it's definitely an outlier. So for those of you who don't know, Seinfeld is a mono blue control deck that really tries to dominate the stack with counterspells. You play upwards of 35 counterspells in the deck.
That's a lot.
Yeah,
You play some bad ones.
definitely more than
That's
you should.
more than a third of the deck.
Yes. So your objective is to, if they play a relevant spell, counter it. If they don't, cast a draw spell. So what you're trying to do with the deck is keep the board clear the entire game. I'm of the view that if you let Llanowar Elves resolve, your opponent should just attack you 20 times and kill you. That's like a better line than ever tapping their Llanowar Elves for mana.
Yeah.
And I've won many games because people tried to tap their Llanowar Elves for mana, and then I won.
Classic
I won
blunder.
on like 5 life or something. So the reason Seinfeld is a bad matchup for mono red is mono red is very good at putting a 1 mana cost creature in play, and turn 1 is the hardest turn for Seinfeld to interact in the way it wants to on the stack. Like, there are only so many free counter spells if you're on the draw. There are only so many 1 mana counter spells even if you're on the play. So just putting a 1-drop into play.
Well,
is
and
like
you're
the
lacking
bane
a
of-
lot of ability to like deal with something after it's resolved because you're
You have like maybe
leaning,
5 cards. that
Yeah,
do
like
that.
you're leaning so hard on like preventative measures that like,
Yeah.
oh, it's a 2/1
We've
on
talked
turn 1.
We've talked a lot about proactive and reactive decks on this podcast. Seinfeld is literally the most reactive deck you can get. It's
It's
the
Aikido.
extreme part of the spectrum.
So
And can we talk really quickly, because you mentioned there that there's maybe 5 answers in the deck to a threat. about density of answers that are required to pass, this test or any of the tests, right? You need more than just one. You can't just put a lightning bolt in your deck and say that it's good.
And typically you need more than 5 even. You need enough to be able to reliably see them in a game, given the context of your deck. So in blue decks, you can have in each category you're allowed to have sort of a few less than non-blue decks, because your cantrips sort of act as multiples in up to a certain extent. Whereas in non-blue decks, you just need to be more redundant. You need to have more of each thing because you don't have the card selection that blue does. So usually if I want to put removal spells in a deck, I want at least 10.
Yeah.
That's
in order to reliably be able to see one, ideally every game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, so that's the basic idea. You need to be able to interact with red in one of the many ways we've described, and you need to have more than just an answer.
Yeah.
There's, I guess, one exception, which is like a Madcap Experiment for Platinum Empyrean is this other like way to beat aggressive decks. But even in the decks that are playing that, they're usually playing a lot of ways to find it.
Yeah.
Or they have recognized that their red matchup is so bad that they have to put this card in their deck, and against red, your plan is basically mulligan to a way to get this into play and nothing else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Also, just to finish this thought, doing the red test is actually a really great idea because red is an archetype you will probably encounter in almost any meta because it's one of the least expensive decks to put together. It's always good.
It's fun to play.
Yeah, and it's
When
fun to play.
some burn spells a good
You
time.
can expect it, I think.
Yeah,
pretty safely.
I definitely agree.
So.
Okay, so the next test we're going to talk about is one, Alex, that you, I think, have been on the giving side of quite often, which is the discard spell test. Known black mage, Alex Steacy. So this is basically, can your deck beat a discard spell?
Targeted discard.
Targeted discard spell. So these are things like Inquisition of Kozilek, Thoughtseize, and Duress are the three ones we think about the most often. And then there are others that you can play as well. Collective Brutality.
Collective Brutality, Hymn to Turak, Tide Hollow Sculler, Sin Collector.
Hymn to Turak's not a targeted discard.
Oh, so if you mean targeted discard, then yeah.
It is random, which is better than
targeted even.
Yeah.
Well,
but it's context different.
Random's not as good as targeted.
Oh no, wait, Kitesail, Freebooter.
Yeah,
that's a good
which
one.
is like completely outclassed that card in every possible way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Pretty much.
Freebooter is pretty real.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about sort of the discard spell test, we want to know, can your deck survive getting discarded out of its opening hand? So are your hands going to be robust enough that if at the start of the game you keep a hand and then you lose the best card out of it, can you still win the game?
Yeah.
So Alex, can you maybe run me through either some decks that are good or bad against it, your choice? Can you think of either people you have annihilated particularly a lot with discard spells, or maybe
I feel like
people you've been frustrated to discard spell?
certain combo decks, like you sort of kick the table leg out, and that can be pretty disastrous sometimes. Or even just like a lot of setup and one bomb, and you get the bomb. That's pretty bad. You know, where you're just like land, ramp spell, other ramp spell, big thing, and you have a way to discard the big thing. Then it's like, well, this is not so good.
Yeah, often combo decks that revolve around one card specifically are really weak to discard. So like Scape Shift is a deck that's very, very weak to discard because they're often tapping out on their turn, looking to set up Scape Shift, which Scape Shift is 2 green for a sorcery, sacrifice any number of lands, search your library for up to that many land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. And so that combos with Valakut, Molten Pinnacle. That's one of the lands you're going to search for. Then you search for as many mountains as you can, put those into play and get a bunch of Valakut triggers to deal a bunch of damage to them. And so the reason discard is particularly good against Scape Shift is although Scape Shift has a lot of tutors for the card Scape Shift, if you actually wait until they tutor for the Scape Shift and then there's a window for you to discard the Scape Shift, they have some because they need them, but they don't actually have a ton of ways to get it back into their hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, once it's binned, it's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they play things like Eternal Witness, Regrowth, Snapcaster Mage, but there's certainly fewer ways to get it back from the graveyard than there is to get it out from the deck.
And this is the Scapeshift deck's answer to the discard spell test, right?
Exactly.
That's the reason why it still technically passes, is we do actually have a way to win still, even if Scapeshift gets discarded. It's hard, but it's possible.
Yeah.
What are some other ways that you can make your deck better or more robust against discard?
Not care.
Okay, elaborate.
What do you mean by that?
Reanimator, for example.
I see.
Sometimes you don't have a good choice on what to discard, and you have to. Although that one could go either way, because it's like if you hit their business spell, that's pretty bad.
Yeah, discard I think is actually like
It's okay against Reanimator.
sort of like secret good against Reanimator, because especially the target random discard is dangerous against Reanimator, but targeted discard is very good because although they have a bunch of redundancy, they often like it's sort of like a 3-card combo. They need a way to get a creature in the bin, a creature, and a reanimation spell. And if you're able to take either the way to get the creature in the bin or the way to get it out of the bin,
Then yeah, they've got problems.
Yeah, they have problems. So
I'm just trying to think, because like I've played historically some aggro decks that don't really mind getting discarded so much. In fact, a lot of decks, even not the ones that I specifically play that have some level of graveyard interaction, if you play all of virtually the same kind of card, you can lose one and just be like, that's a drag, but I have like 3 other creatures that are roughly that power level. So, you know, you've slowed me down a little bit. It's not like a crippling blow.
I think that's the best way to build your deck to be good against discard. So if you have a lot of discard spells in your meta, just building a very redundant deck is just the best way to beat them, because then you're still trading 1 for 1. You're actually up on tempo because they spent mana and a card
Like
to take a card from you.
I was gonna say, like, White Weenie probably doesn't mind discard all that much.
No.
It's just like, you got my Thalion, that's bad, but like I have, you know, 2 1-drop Pikers and like Swords to Plowshares.
Although often taking Armageddon can be.
Yeah, that could be pretty bad.
They have a couple cards they don't want to get discarded, but the rest.
But it's
of their
not like
deck is
it's
fairly
not a
redundant.
disaster if they lose.
No.
Yeah.
Armageddon.
And I think the answer to the discard test a lot of the times is like, meh. Like a lot of decks that they're like, well, it's bad if I get discarded, or it's like kind of obnoxious, but
My game plan isn't thrown in the trash.
Yes,
by it.
exactly.
I think this question is maybe the most polarizing. Either your deck is like pretty bad, you're like, oh please no, or your deck is sort of like on the other side, just like you know.
What's your reaction to Turn On Thoughtseize?
I'd really rather not, but
or
yeah,
you know.
I hate to keep harping on the same deck here, but yeah, High Tide no good against the old discard. You get your High Tide discarded, it's real bad.
It's really similar to Scapeshift in that like it has a couple ways to get it out of the bin, but
not a lot.
Not a whole lot.
So I had a game, this is many years ago now, where my opponent went turn 1, Black Mox, Black Land, cast Deathrite Shaman, Thoughtseize your High Tide, and then
and then had a bunch of extra mana. What did they do with that?
No, they'd used all their mana.
Oh, I thought for some reason.
No, I didn't say Lotus.
Oh, okay, I was
Mox,
like-
Mox Jet.
But they get to
still-
untap and
Eat the High Tide, and it's gone
That's
forever.
so.
It was
use the High Tide.
it was not ideal. I did
Feels
not.
bad,
I did
man.
did not win that game. And then another deck. You'll notice Jeremy and I play many decks that seem to fail a lot of these tests. Tin Fins is really quite poor against discard. I can't win basically if someone steals Entomb. If you get your Entomb discarded, it's not good.
Yeah. Any deck that's very reliant on one card or one type of card that there isn't a lot of. So like
Dragonstorm's not good against high discard spells.
Never lucky. Yeah, so typically combo decks are the ones that are gonna
Weakest.
Yeah.
be the weakest. Yeah, Time Vault is another one that really doesn't like getting
I mean,
Thoughtseize.
most A+Bs if you get one or the other.
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. So basically, when you're looking to answer this question, it's possible that if there's a lot of discard in your metagame and you want to be able to pass the discard test, you just got to make sure you play the right deck. It's not actually. You'll notice a lot of the times we're not answering these questions with things like put Leyline of Sanctity in your deck because there's 100 cards in your deck. You just can't. It's not like a format like Modern or Legacy where you can just plan to.
These are the correct sideboard choices for
right,
this type
exactly,
of meta.
where you can put a powerful answer to a problem you might have.
Yeah, there's
in your deck.
way too. Well, there's A, too many decks, and B, too many options for ways you could hedge around this kind of thing.
And the format's too high variance. You just aren't going to draw that Leyline, or you aren't going to draw whatever it is you need.
It's like, just like add ley line.
on top every time.
A sprinkle of ley line.
Does anyone else have any other thoughts, closing thoughts on discard?
So one thing you can do is put in some cheaper counter spells, which are usually going to be able to come down the turn that they try to cast discard. So if you weren't playing Spell Pierce in your blue deck and you find hand attack is becoming a problem, adding Spell Pierce and Force Spike and Mental Misstep, those types of things can help against discard. So there are a few things you can do. It's not completely deck dependent, but yeah, there are.
These are also counter spells that have some amount of utility against other spells besides discard.
What's the red spell that hides your hand and slow trips?
What?
I know what you're talking about. I don't know what it's called.
Not-
it's one in a red. It costs
Ignorant
2.
Bliss.
Yeah.
It's called Ignorant Bliss. It's 1 in a red for an instant. You exile your hand.
Yeah.
At the end of the turn, return those cards to your hand, then draw a card.
Oh yeah, don't play this.
No. Unless you're playing Mental Magic, in which case it's great.
Yeah, it is.
If the Spirit Guides aren't... all right.
Okay, no.
Okay, no more closing thoughts on discard. We're going to move on to the next one, which is, can your deck beat a counterspell? We've been talking about counterspells a lot. They're probably one of the more prevalent effects in Eternal Magic on a whole, and no different in Highlander. So the nature of this question is very similar to discard. Does your deck completely fold to a counterspell? If you're playing any of the decks I've listed off so far, the answer is yes. But let's talk about some other decks that are bad against counterspells or good against counterspells. Dealer's choice. You could choose to talk about either or.
This question's a little similar to the discard one.
Totally.
Whereas it's like different times at which it's going to happen. But this is just like, do you really, really, really need this spell to resolve or this permanent to enter the field? See, I'm just thinking about aggro, where it's just like you keep feeding them threats until they run out of counter spells, and then you just like...
Yeah.
Redundancy is also a good way to beat counterspells.
Yeah, I mean, but not just aggro, like even sort of mid-rangey strategies I've found where it's just like you just keep asking the same question until they run out of answers. They're just like, how about this thing that kills you? Okay, you countered it. How about this thing that kills you? Okay, you countered it. How about this thing that kills you? Oh, you ran out of counter spells. I'm going to kill you with it.
And I think one thing to note about counterspells is they tend to run on the more expensive side, especially when in Highlander, where there's only so many 2-mana counterspells. We have to play the 3-mana ones. We have to play the 4-mana ones. And so if you can offer threats that are going to force your opponent to trade up, or they're threats that are going to trade up on mana, they're going to take 3 of your opponent's mana, but only 2 of your own, or something like that. That's going to be another helpful way to be more robust against counterspells. So that's why aggro is so good against counterspells.
Also, just having your bait game really good.
Yep.
You're just like pretending that what you're putting on the stack is like the best threat you have, and then when they counter, it's like, JK.
I had another one.
That's the biggest thing, is also, as Liam said, trading up on mana is really good, and also being able to cast 2 spells in one turn, because the mana in Highlander isn't as good as it is in other formats, so often they don't have like quad blue to cast 2 counter spells if they have like Logic Not and counter spell.
Yeah. They always have triple blue for Cryptic, though. Every time. Every time.
Yeah.
Don't play triple. Don't play
Cryptic
triple
Command.
pips unless it's Cryptic Command. In which case, always play Cryptic Command.
This card is very good.
So what kind of decks are bad against counterspells? We've talked about wanting to be cheap and wanting to be efficient, so it would naturally follow that decks that are expensive and all in on one thing are worse, or...
So traditionally, ramp strategies are very, very weak against
yeah.
against counterspells, and they're often actually better against discard than counterspells, because often they'll keep hands that are just like lands and ramp spells and just like plan to play whatever threats they get off the top, which isn't... Discard is not very good against, but counterspells are, because like the classic saying is you can't Thoughtseize the top of their deck, but you can counterspell any spell in the stack. So
Yeah, I mean, like, and there's only, like, in a ramp strategy, there's only so many, like, can't be countered, like, ramp hits. that you could be playing. Like, there's a few good ones, like Carnage Tyrant, but if you're ramping, you want to get to like 6+ mana and drop something that's going to annihilate them. And a lot of those are vulnerable to counter spells.
Yeah, and so the reason, just to go into a bit more depth of why that's not a good strategy against counter spells, is you're giving them time to like cast cantrips, establish their hand,
And find plenty of them.
more counter spells.
Sometimes set up pressure even to force you to cast your spells.
Exactly.
Because counter spells is, I think, maybe the one test that we're gonna talk about today, where one of the answers is just play better, and it's like this definitely spawns the like classic, like the two most hated things in Magic are discard spells and counter spells, and there's sort of like two camps. Like some people really dislike discard spells,
like you,
and some people really dislike counter spells. And I think a lot of it spawns from the feeling of like what happens when someone casts one of those spells. But it really is true when someone's like assuming they're only playing counter spells and they don't have pressure to back it up or anything. You know, you were saying like your bait game can be good. You can play in a way such that you trick your opponent, or you convince them that one thing is important when in fact you have a more important thing that's coming down the pipe next.
So counter spells, especially if you're new to the game of Magic, they seem like this like invincible barrier of like denial, and they're really not that. There are ways to deal with them, and you know, I'm not saying that it's invalid to have the sensation where it's just like, you know, everything I play counters. It's like, you know, that probably happens a lot, but it's just like you have options that you can circumvent that, either from playstyle or deck building construction, and like you have to utilize those options, because like if you just keep ramming the same strategy against them over and over again and expecting different results, that's also not going to work.
Yeah, I think it can feel like they always have it, and
a lot of times they don't.
Yeah,
you got to make them have it.
You'll learn with time that's exactly right. Yeah, you can get into situations where you've actually exhausted them of counterspells. I think that's actually maybe the most common trap people fall into with this test, is they assume that their opponent's hand is like island, 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 counterspell, 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 and then the top of their deck is counterspell, 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 when in actual fact their hand is like island, island, land that doesn't make the color they need, counterspell, draw spell, card that does nothing.
Yeah.
And they counter your first spell, and then you live in fear of this important thing that you want to resolve.
Then
never
you
resolving.
pass the turn, they cast draw spell, and then they find second
Yeah.
counterspell.
Yeah.
So it's just like, you know, lean on them, put cards in your deck that they can't deal with. It's like Blue Mages love Thrun. They love Thrun.
They don't.
We do not huge fans of Thrun.
Ooga chaka.
So let's maybe sum up how you can go about making a deck that passes the counterspell test. What are some key things we can look at? Being efficient, so cheap, efficient cards. What else? Having
Redundancy.
Redundancy is good.
Or threat density is another way to...
Yeah, and then lastly, just learning how to better play around counterspells. Maybe.
Also, like speaking of Thrun, having cards or effects that circumvent counterspells.
Right.
Because, you know, obviously spells that can't be countered are good, but you can't really counterspell lands.
Right. That's actually a really good point.
Yeah.
Which, like, popped into my head.
Right, so playing like creature lands.
Creature lands are really good against blue, because it's like, you can't counter my Mishra's Factory.
Yeah.
Or the activation thereof, as I beat you to death with it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Another really good way to beat counterspells is to be able to cast spells on your opponent's turn and then again on your turn. So anything with flash or an instant that they're going to need to counter is a really good way, because that's like a functional way of casting two spells in the same turn, at least from the Blue Mage's perspective.
Yeah, you get to use 2 cycles of your mana for their 1 cycle of mana.
Exactly, so
like
you force them to have 2 counterspells in the same cycle of untapping.
Yeah. So those are the kind of things, and unlike with discard spells, where there's not a ton of like great, this card is just generically good against discard spells, there are just cards that are good against counter spells, and we've talked about a bunch of them here, and there are more.
Yeah, there's a tiny handful of cards that are good against discard. Like
Obstinate Bailoth,
Loxodon on Smiter. Wiltleaf Liege.
Dodecapod.
Nobody plays
The best one of all.
Dodecapod.
The new one, like a Johnny's something or another from M19.
I don't even know.
You get a 4/4 flyer.
This thing is a 5/5 if they discard you. I gotta start
I
putting
remember what
some.
it's called. Yeah,
Johnny's Last
Beach
Stand?
nailed it. A Johnny's Last Stand.
Well done, Beach.
What?
Whenever it's 2 and 2 white, whenever a creature or planeswalker you control dies, you may sacrifice a Johnny's Last Stand. If you do, create a 4/4 white avatar creature with token with flying. Or when a spell or an ability an opponent controls causes you to discard this card, if you control a planes, create a 4/4 avatar creature with flying.
What a weird card.
So Liam, now that they've printed this, you can play 5 play sets of cards that come into play off Liliana of the Veil's +1.
Perfect.
You could play anti-Liliana of the Veil Tribal.
I already did that. It was stopping playing Modern. Was my approach to playing anti-Liliana of the Veil Tribal.
Tough but fair.
Okay, so yeah, so that's counterspells, and those are the ways that you can deal with counterspells and pass that test. The last test that we have is another one that has to do with the clock. So aggro was to do with the clock, but it's a little bit different. This is the can your deck beat a linear combo deck's clock. So we're talking about like, Storm is going to kill you on turn 3 or 4. High Tide's going to kill you on turn 5. Eggs is going to kill you on turn 3 or 4. Paradox Academy is going to kill you on turn 3 or 4. What's your deck's plan to deal with it? And I think this might be the test that the most decks fail.
Probably.
And that's okay, because the decks that don't fail it pass it with like flying colors.
Well, they pass
Well,
it
that's
real
the thing.
well.
It's either like a lot of the other ones were sort of like grayscale. You could like get like an 80%, and that's pretty good.
Right.
But this one's more binary. You either
10 or
Yeah,
90.
this is a pass-fail test as opposed to a
Yeah.
a percentage-based one.
yeah.
So when we're talking about these combo decks, why are they so difficult to interact with for some decks?
Well, specifically for anything that involves like artifacts or enchantments, like A plus B sort of combos, like Painter, Servant, Grindstone kind of thing, is difficult for like, I guess like a linear aggro strategy to deal with, because they're just like,
It's so good.
Wow, it's just a hockey fight. They're looking to like unload fists
Yeah.
into you until you pass out.
Yeah, when Allison was on the podcast, that's exactly what she said. She was like, yeah, my deck is looking to basically get into a stand-up fight. You're going to hit me as hard as you can, then I'm going to hit you as hard as I can, and problematically, the combo decks hit me so hard I can't get up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like
I thought that analogy was really
It's
good.
good.
she's playing like really, really powerful cards. They're playing really bad cards that just win the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're just sort of, they're gonna stand there while you punch them, and if they're still conscious by round 4, they pull out a shotgun and like blow you away with it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I found it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have a lot of interaction, because like the types of cards that they utilize, they're sometimes ones that are difficult to interact with. It's like playing a specific answers an artifact, or even more rarely answers an enchantment effect, is not something you frequently put into your deck, and when you do, it's usually like a dual function card, and then even then you don't have many of them.
Well, yeah, and one of the problem is that some of the only types of cards that interact with combo on a meaningful basis are discard and counter spells.
Yeah.
And if your deck doesn't play either of those, one of the only other ways you can interact with them
Beep, beep.
is with their life total,
Yeah, and just killing them faster than they can kill you.
which is hard if you're not doing any of the discarding or counter
Yeah,
spelling,
it's
because
it's
these
difficult.
decks are very, very good at assembling their win condition.
Yeah, like if you don't have targeted discard counterspells, or some sort of like
disruptive
well,
creature.
some sort of disruptive creature, or like an effect that hates out their combo in a way that like actually makes it not work, you have to lean on the gas as hard and fast as you can, because you just need to race.
Yeah, get the nitro in there.
Yeah, get the nitro, like really pressure them so that maybe they start making like dubious fetches and expending more life points than they ought to, trying to get to their combo, and maybe just falling a little bit short.
And so this test, I think, is maybe one of the harder ones to tune your deck to be better about, because I think it's one of those ones where either your deck is playing, as Jared mentioned, sort of like counterspells, discards, or maybe some disruptive hate bears, effects like that, or you're not. And there's some decks where you can maybe slide in some of the disruptive hate pairs, and it's not going to interrupt the core strategy. But most of the time, if you're playing blue, you're already playing counter spells. If you're playing black, you're already playing discard spells. So it's not often going to be the case that you have access to these colors and you're not already playing those effects. One thing you might decide to do if you find yourself constantly failing this test is add one of those colors to your deck, specifically in order to shore up this matchup to make a.
Yeah, it's like if you're white weenie, you can sprinkle in some black, make a gray weenie.
Totally.
That has a little bit more tech against.
Or if you're mono green aggro, you can add some green and get a little moldy. Although, or add some black.
I was like, mono green with green is extra
green add green,
mono
more
black
green.
aggro, add a little bit of green with some support.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this test is, I think, maybe the least nuanced to talk about, right? It's sort of like, well, there are these cards that are good against combo decks. They're in these sort of like very set.
It's like, okay, Time Vault, key.
And
what
one thing I want to talk about briefly on this one is that if you have access to these things in your deck, one thing you have to do is mulligan very aggressively if your clock is typically not going to be good enough to beat their clock. Like, if you're playing black and you think you can't win without one of the 3 targeted discard spells, you should mulligan to 5 to get one of those targeted discard spells.
Because otherwise, matchup's not going to be that great.
They're going to get you.
Yeah, you might end up throwing out hands that look great against every other hand, but it's just like, I have to have a turn 1 threat or something, or a disruptive whatchamacallit.
Yeah. Jared and I played a match a couple of weeks ago now where I was on Flash Hulk and Jared was on like green-black Delirium, and Jared mulliganed 15 times. He mulliganed a second 5 every game in order to find a discard spell, because it was the only way he had to immediately...
Mulligan 24 times in 2 matches, then dropped.
You played against...
I won one of those matches.
Best laid plans.
Yeah, you won one of the games in our match, too.
Yeah, I went 3-3 in games.
Yeah.
Just was not enjoyable.
But yeah, so that's another good point. So when we're talking about passing this test, it's you got to have the cards in your deck and you've got to actively look for them. If you have them in your deck and you actively look for them, it should help. And if there's a ton of combo in the room in the metagame that you're playing in, add more. And there almost always are more discard and counter spells. For discard, sometimes you have to get a little dark and dirty. I haven't seen anyone play Encroach in quite some time, but you definitely could if you wanted to.
That's not usually the type of targeted discard we're looking for. I think Divest is actually a pretty playable one.
It gets a land.
Depending
it's so
on
bad.
It only gets a non-basic land.
I know.
So garbage. Don't play. Like, come on, blackmail is better than this card.
Yeah, that's probably
that one you can actually probably play.
All right, fair enough. Yeah. So like, that
it's got braids on it.
But like, blackmail is a card you can play. Transgress the Mind, actually, when Flash Hulk was really popular, that's a card I played a little bit of because
I don't remember that one.
Just read it and you'll see why it Shadow Realms them.
Oh no!
So its target player reveals his or her hand. You may choose a card with converted mechanic cost 3 or greater, and you exile that card. So if you ever hit their Hulk, they just die.
Yeah, they can't win.
More or less.
They have to naturally assemble all the cards.
That seems unlikely.
Well,
it is
it costs
unlikely.
15 mana. It's not easy. So anyway, so that's basically the idea of how you're going to make your matchup against, or how you're going to pass this test better. So Alex mentioned this at the top of the show, but I think it's important to mention it again now. Not every deck is going to pass all these tests. The very best decks in the format often do, and that's why they're so good. For instance, Jeskai Control is a really popular, really powerful deck. Blue Moon was a really popular, really powerful deck. Those decks have answers to all these questions. But if your deck doesn't answer all these questions with a yes, that's probably okay. You probably want to answer more than half of them with a yes, or at least have some semblance of a plan for some of them, even if it's maybe not super likely. But please don't feel as though your deck is completely unplayable if it fails one of these tests.
Yeah, that's just not going to be true.
A, your deck is not unplayable. B, sometimes it's fun to play the unplayable decks.
Especially if your deck is like very, very good at some of the other
yes,
tests.
I guess that's maybe a better way.
Like if your deck is like very, very good against aggro and very, very redundant, so it's like mostly good against discard and counter spells, but like you're just never beating combo in a million years. That's probably okay for most metagames.
Yeah, I mean sometimes the bracketing works out in your favor.
Yeah, you just never play the deck.
Or it's just like, Joey who plays combo was sick today. Just not here. Just not here. Hey.
So the last thing we're going to talk about before we wrap the show up is that these are the really broad tests, the ones we've introduced here. But there are more specific ones that might be more related to your meta, because we understand that many of you watching the show who are maybe playing a local meta either have a smaller meta where people play the same deck a little bit more often, or maybe you just only play with a couple other people. And so if that happens, or if a meta game develops where there are really popular decks, different questions might arise that you need to ask yourself. So for instance, in Victoria for a long time, there was this test you had to be able to answer, which is that can your deck beat a Platinum Empyrean? Does your deck beat the pass the Madcap Experiment test? And so this is a Madcap Experiment. We've talked about it a lot. Serge isn't here to
Malign.
Yeah, but so this is Madcap Experiment is a 3 and a red sorcery that says put target Platinum Empyrean into play. What it really says is reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card, put that card into the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Madcap Experiment deals damage to you and equal to the number of cards revealed this way. Platinum Empyrean makes it so that your life total can't change. The way these cards are worded and templated means you play Madcap Experiment, you put a Platinum Empyrean in play, you take 0 damage, and you can't take any more damage until this dies.
And you paid half price for a card that is an 8/8 beater that makes it so your life total can't change.
Exactly. So for a long time, about a year, if you were playing an aggressive deck, or even a mid-range deck, you had to have ways to beat Platinum Empyrean. So the red decks started playing a bunch more Shatters. Mono White became much more popular because exile effects are, aces against this card. Smash the Smithereens is actually the one you're looking for. Those Shatters, oh god, that art's actually really good.
That's really cool.
It is really good.
Did Tin Street Hooligan make a comeback?
Yep. People who were playing Gruul actually became a little more popular than it had been.
because you had like
because
Pythian Renegades, Tin Street,
That I feel like
Reclamation
yeah,
Sage.
that's a good example of
Crashing
just like
Brontodon.
passing that test very well, because like Gruul has a lot of answers to artifacts. It's just
Played
like
Destructive Revelry.
smashy.
Exactly. And so now that card isn't as popular, and so you don't have to pass that test. You don't, and as a result, the red decks no longer play nearly as many Shatters. That's okay. So locally, you might find yourself coming across your own tests like this. One that Jared brought up is you might find that your room is full of Wraths, turn 4 Wrath of God, and you might need to develop a plan to beat Wrath of God on turn 4. You might reliably be playing against that. So that might mean playing more Planeswalkers. That might mean playing threats that can survive through it.
Playing Aristocrats, where you can get Wrath and actually be happy about it.
Or you can play cards that actually counter the Wrath. There's cards like Rapid Vigor. There's cards...
Pardon?
All right, Rapid Vigor doesn't actually beat Wrath of God, but it beats the other ones. I think it's called Rapid Vigor.
Hang on.
Might be wrong.
You could play Golgari aggro and just like come back the next turn.
There's cards like Heroic Intervention, which is just better than Rapid Vigor.
Yeah, give all your creatures.
Oh yeah, that card is hot.
Actually, that card's really good.
I think it's underplayed for sure.
Yeah, it's
So there
Heroic
are...
Intervention, by the way, is 1 and a green, permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until
Permanent.
end of turn.
It's an instant.
yeah. Your whole board virtually can't be touched.
I have casted in response to a Ravages of War before.
Oh,
Felt good.
oh wait.
Choking on your dab.
Yeah, it's because it's over.
The old Plague Wind my own lands. They were
It's
not
like,
unused.
oh, I see. I have acted in error.
Yes, I have made a mistake. So these are you'll be able to figure out these kinds of tests. If you keep losing to the same thing, make it a test, right? Say, how does my deck beat X thing, and figure out a way that it's that you're going to get around it.
Yeah, I guess the important thing is like, if you are always losing to something, identify why that happens and change something.
Yeah.
Change your playstyle, change your deck composition, whatever. Like
And if you end up coming across a test and you like have identified the test and can't figure out how to beat it, feel free to comment on the video or get at one of us on Twitter and be like, hey, like I have this test, can't figure out how to beat it. You have any insight?
how do I beat turn 1 Exodia?
Tough.
Don't ask me about that.
Difficult.
That's not one I have a good answer
Yeah,
for.
this one guy just shows up with his, Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and I can't beat it.
Call a judge, perhaps.
Just get him expelled.
But so the one last thing is
That I didn't need to see that.
Holy moly.
I'm glad. Those of you who are listening to this,
You're lucky.
you're lucky.
You consider yourselves the lucky
Oh,
ones.
great! Now it's
not
been high.
Highlander
We're good.
Evolution.
That's cool.
No, I'm just going to push straight through. So the important thing to keep in mind with these tests is you want to keep them in mind when you're tuning a deck that already exists. But they're even more important when you're thinking about building a new deck. So when you're building a brand new deck and you are brewing and you're putting cards in, you have to think about what are the tests, what are the constraints of the format that I'm addressing. And when you put cards in, or when you're thinking about cards to put into your deck, you have to ask, does this card help me pass one of those tests? Or is it doing so? Is it helping me pass the test better than some other card that I'm going to take out for it? And again, it's okay to fail some of them. Definitely can't fail all of them unless you're playing Dragonstorm, in which case it's okay.
Yeah.
Sort of. It's not
Somewhat.
not that okay.
A little bit.
Great. Any final thoughts out of either of you? Any last ideas?
No, just think about your deck and revise.
Yeah. So without further ado, let's hit our closing segment. Powerful magic. It's much harder.
It's like he's really here.
Who, me?
Serge.
Serge. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, I am budget Serge. All right. Jerry, you're on for Powerful Magic today. Tell me more about your Powerful Magic story.
Well, this past Monday, I played Scape Shift.
Okay.
Came back to an old friend. Wanted to try it out with Spellseeker because
Right.
that's just in the 4-color version you're able to play Demonic Tutor and Mystical Tutor, and so it turns out Spellseeker just also finds Scape Shift. It also finds 4 mana sorceries if you try hard.
Yeah.
So wanted to try it out, and so I was playing a 4-color version with no white, pretty all in on the combo, and I was playing against a blue control deck. The game was super grindy. We both had nothing in play for a long time. I was beaten down with a Coiling Oracle. They had nothing. We were playing Drago.
I think you mean Manaconda.
I had Valakut in play, and then I looked down and I was like counting mountains, and it turns out I had 4 mountains in play. And then I cast a Cultivate. Went and got 2 mountains. Mountain into play Mountain, Bolt.
Yeah, 3U.
Yeah. Then I drew a Wood Elves, got another Mountain, Bolt.
Get him!
And they were at like 18 when I started attacking. And then they needed to start like using removal spells on my 1/1s, and I just kept drawing ramp spells. And eventually I was able to get them down to 3, and I was able to Mystical Teachings for Bolt to bolt them out.
Wow.
So I just like I was just able to value Valakut them out.
The slow burn.
That's hot.
Escape shift not required.
No.
Sweet.
I could have Mystical Teachings for a way to get Scape Shift and just like
gotten 1 mountain.
Scape Shifted. I would have got 2 just in case, but
you wanted to swag.
This was like turn like 24 or something.
Yeah.
I had 1 million lands in play.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yep.
But
all right,
that was pretty hilarious.
Right.
The deck that's like very, very good at doing exactly one thing, and like Plan B is just so much worse than Plan A.
Yeah, when Plan B is play mountains for 12 turns.
But sometimes, if your opponent does enough powerful nothing.
Sweet. All right, well, thanks so much for everyone for watching. A reminder that, as always, the show is brought to you by you over at patreon.com/LoadingReadyRun. So thanks so much for your support. If you have any more questions about these sorts of things, feel free to tweet at us. Our Twitters are all linked below, and we'll see you next time. Bye.